It was supposed to be a quiet morning, a painful one, yes, but simple. Just a woman trying to catch a flight to say goodbye to someone she loved. A congresswoman, no less, with every credential and reason to be there. But when Emily Sanders arrived at Dallas Love Field, things began to shift. A subtle smirk from the gate agent. A vague explanation about a reassigned seat. And then the words no traveler wants to hear, "You've been flagged for a random review." She stayed calm. She showed her ID. But instead of respect, she got suspicion. Instead of help, humiliation. Her body searched, her belongings unpacked in public view, and her flight, her last chance to attend her cousin's funeral, took off without her. Alone, angry, and holding back tears, she sent just 3 words to the one person who had always seen her, not just as a congresswoman, but as a human being. "I need you." What happened next made every person in that terminal rethink everything they thought they knew about power, dignity, and justice. After a long week of grueling travel, Emily Sanders, a U.S. congresswoman, finally arrived at Dallas Love Field Airport, weighed down not just by exhaustion but by the looming grief of her cousin's funeral. She had been looking forward to this moment, to finally saying goodbye to someone she cherished. It was supposed to be a simple task: board her flight and grieve in peace. But as she approached the gate, everything changed. She presented her congressional ID with the ease of routine, prepared for the usual quick check-in. Instead, she was met with an unexpected and dismissive glance from the gate agent, who barely looked at her ID before informing her that her seat had been reassigned. Confused, Emily tried to stay composed, thinking it was simply a mistake. But then the agent dropped the bombshell: "You've been flagged for a random review." Her heart sank. She was calm, composed, too composed, perhaps, but deep inside, a storm was brewing. Why her? Why now? She had done nothing wrong, and yet, the treatment felt less like a random check and more like an accusation. She felt the creeping coldness of suspicion directed solely at her, despite her proper credentials. The airport, a place she'd visited countless times before without incident, suddenly felt alien and hostile. With no explanation, the TSA staff arrived, and Emily was ushered away from the gate, her personal space invaded by strangers. The pat-down was thorough, impersonal, and humiliating. Her belongings were torn apart and examined as though they were contraband, not something as personal as the carefully packed items of a grieving woman. The moments dragged on. The humiliation set in, gnawing at her, but she refused to show weakness. As she watched the clock tick past the departure time, the reality hit her like a punch to the gut: she had missed her flight. She would miss the chance to be with family, to mourn. The sting of injustice washed over her, but she held it together, barely. She pulled out her phone, hands trembling, and typed the words that would change everything: "I need you." It was simple, but to Emily, it was a call for help, a desperate plea for someone who could see past the uniform, the procedures, and understand what was truly at stake. As Emily stood in the stark, sterile room, the chaos around her seemed to blur. The agents moved with robotic precision, rifling through her bags as if looking for something they already believed to be there. She could hear the clatter of her personal items being tossed aside, each item, a book, a jacket, a framed picture of her late mother, handled as if they were nothing more than objects, disconnected from the person who had packed them. But for Emily, each item represented something far more meaningful. They weren't just belongings, they were pieces of her life, of her identity. Yet, here she was, reduced to nothing more than the sum of her belongings being violated without cause or explanation. She had never felt so exposed in her life. Her cheeks burned with a mixture of humiliation and helplessness, but she swallowed the emotions down, not wanting to give the agents the satisfaction of seeing her vulnerable. She had been through worse in her career, public scrutiny, late-night arguments in Congress, the relentless weight of being a woman in power. But this felt different. This wasn't just political or professional. This was personal. With every passing moment, the realization set in more sharply: I'm going to miss the funeral. Her cousin, the one person who had always been there for her, was now gone, and she was stuck here, alone in a cold, sterile room, treated as though she had done something wrong. The plane had already left, and she had no way of getting to the place where she was needed most. The thought of not being able to say goodbye, the thought of her family mourning without her, sent a sharp pang through her chest. It wasn't just about missing a flight, it was about missing a moment she could never get back. Emily's hands gripped the edge of the table as she fought the rising tide of panic. She could feel the anger and frustration building within her, but she knew she couldn't let it show. The more she tried to stay calm, the more she realized how trapped she was in this system, how powerless she was, despite her position. She was used to fighting for causes she believed in, used to being heard in the halls of power. But here, in this moment, her status meant nothing. In this moment, she was just another woman, just another passenger who had somehow become a target. The unfairness of it all clawed at her, threatening to undo the calm exterior she was struggling to maintain. The minutes stretched on like an eternity. She could feel the clock ticking away in the background, reminding her of how precious every second was, seconds she was wasting while her cousin's funeral slipped further and further out of reach. When the TSA agents finally stepped back, their faces impassive, they told her what she already feared: the flight was gone. There was no way she could make it. The words felt like a punch to the gut. The sense of powerlessness hit her like a wave, leaving her breathless and angry all at once. She had been treated as though she were a criminal, when all she had done was try to board a plane to mourn a family member. Tears stung at the corners of her eyes, but she held them back. She couldn't let herself break, not now. Not in front of these people who had made it clear that they saw her as nothing more than a routine inconvenience. But as her mind raced with thoughts of the injustice she had just endured, a quiet voice whispered inside her, "I can't let this go." She was angry. She was hurt. But more than anything, she was determined. Determined that this moment, this humiliation, would not define her. She had to do something. She needed someone to see her, not just as a congresswoman, but as a human being who had been wronged. With shaky hands, Emily took out her phone. She stared at the screen for a moment, fighting the urge to throw it across the room. She needed someone who understood, someone who could make things right. She typed a simple message: "I need you." The words were simple, but they carried everything she couldn't say. The fear. The frustration. The plea for help. She pressed send, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she allowed herself a tiny sliver of hope, that someone would come, that someone would finally help her be seen. As Emily sat there, feeling the oppressive weight of the moment pressing down on her, she couldn't help but replay every part of the ordeal over and over in her mind. The gate agent's dismissive smirk. The casual way her valid credentials were brushed aside. The painstaking search through her belongings as if she were a criminal. Every moment had chipped away at her composure, leaving her with a sense of violation that she had never experienced before, even in her most challenging political confrontations. She had always been a woman who prided herself on maintaining control, on never letting the frustrations of life get the best of her. But this was different. There was no talking her way out of this situation, no smooth negotiation or strategic speech that could sway the agents into realizing their mistake. She had done everything right, followed every protocol, yet here she was, stranded, humiliated, and powerless. The harsh fluorescent lights above her buzzed softly in the background as the minutes stretched on. Each second that passed felt like an eternity. She glanced at the clock, then back at the security officers who seemed to ignore her presence entirely as they continued their inspection. Emily's mind raced, not just with thoughts of the funeral she was missing, but with a deepening realization that this moment symbolized something much larger. This wasn't just about one woman's missed flight, it was about the systemic inequities that allowed people like her to be treated this way simply because they didn't fit the stereotypical mold of a model passenger. This was about a country that still allowed implicit biases to thrive, unchecked, in public spaces. This was a test of her resilience, a test of her dignity. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone, the weight of it in her hand grounding her in the present moment. "I need you." The words were simple, but they carried the enormity of her feelings, the desperation, the hurt, and the realization that she couldn't do this alone. She needed someone who could not only help her find justice in this situation but also make sure that the invisible forces that allowed this kind of treatment to happen were addressed. With a deep breath, she pressed send. As soon as the message was out, a strange calm washed over her. She was no longer completely alone in this. And then, as if summoned by her thoughts, the door to the sterile room opened, and in walked Richard Sanders. The room seemed to exhale collectively. Time slowed for a moment as Emily's eyes locked onto him. There was something undeniably authoritative in the way he carried himself. He wasn't just any man, he was a former federal judge, someone who had spent his life navigating the complex webs of law and power. His presence in the room was like a shift in the air. Suddenly, things seemed less dire, less suffocating. Richard didn't rush, didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped into the room and assessed the situation with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen and understood the inner workings of bureaucracy. His very presence exuded calm, but there was a steely edge to his composure that was hard to miss. Without a word to anyone, he turned to Emily, his eyes softening when they met hers, as if saying without speaking, "You're not alone anymore." The shift in the room was palpable. The TSA agents, who had been walking around with a sense of authority moments before, now seemed unsure of themselves. The air, once thick with tension, now hummed with a quiet intensity as Richard began to speak. His voice was steady, clear, and unwavering, each word measured and deliberate. He wasn't here to ask for apologies or compensation. He was here for something far more profound. He questioned the legitimacy of the actions that had been taken against Emily, pointing out the lack of explanation and the clear biases that had been at play. There was no room for negotiation with him, only the cold, hard truth. Emily sat there, her emotions churning as she listened to Richard calmly dissect the situation. The anger she had felt earlier now mixed with a deep sense of gratitude. He had done what she could not, he had taken charge, cut through the bureaucracy, and turned the tide in a way only someone with his knowledge and authority could. But even as he worked to untangle the mess she was in, Emily couldn't shake the sharp edge of the injustice she had faced. This was never just about a flight, she thought bitterly. It was about being seen for who she was, not as a congresswoman, but as a person whose worth had been questioned, whose presence had been deemed unworthy by the very system she had spent her career fighting to improve. When the airline staff finally offered a rebooking in first class, Emily felt a surge of disbelief. This was their solution? This was how they thought they could make amends? She could feel her chest tighten with frustration. "It's not about comfort," she said, her voice firm, the sting of indignation still present but controlled. "It's about respect. Dignity. You've taken something from me that can't be fixed by an upgrade or an apology. What happened here is bigger than any of that." Richard nodded in agreement, his eyes never leaving the staff as he spoke. "We're not here for compensation. We're here because what happened was wrong, and it's time for you to understand that." There was no argument from the staff, no more offers of compensation. The room fell silent, the realization settling in, The truth had been spoken, and there was no turning back now. Emily and Richard stood there together, their silent defiance speaking volumes, knowing this battle wasn't just for them, it was for everyone who had been wronged by an unjust system. And though Emily's flight had been missed, she felt, for the first time in hours, a spark of something she hadn't realized she was missing: hope. As the last words of the exchange settled into the heavy silence, Emily took a deep breath, feeling the air in her lungs like it had been blocked for hours. The tension that had been strangling her chest, the tight quill of frustration and helplessness, was slowly starting to unravel. Richard's calm presence beside her was grounding. He had been the anchor she didn't know she needed. But now that the immediate confrontation had passed, Emily could feel the lingering weight of what had just transpired. The humiliation, the sense of violation, were still there, hiding beneath the surface, even though the staff had backed down and the situation was slowly being resolved. Richard turned to Emily, his expression unreadable for a moment before softening. He could see the toll this had taken on her, despite her composed exterior. The truth was, even the strongest of people had their limits. And Emily, despite everything she had achieved, despite her years of public service and the battles she'd fought in the political arena, was human. She was only one person, and the world was often much harder on her than it ever should have been. "I'm sorry you had to go through this," Richard said quietly, his voice filled with a depth of sincerity. He wasn't just apologizing for the situation, he was apologizing for the system, for a world that had allowed this kind of treatment to happen in the first place. And Emily felt it, felt the weight of his words, his understanding. He wasn't just a judge who had retired from his post. He was a man who saw her, who truly understood the pain of what it meant to be treated as less than, despite doing everything right. Emily didn't reply right away. She sat there for a moment, her mind whirling with thoughts, her gaze unfocused. The anger was still there, bubbling just under the surface, but it was tempered now. It was a complex mixture of righteous indignation and a quiet resignation. She could never fully explain how she felt in this moment, not to anyone who hadn't been through something similar. But what Richard had done, what he had given her, was more than she had expected. It wasn't just the legal language, the quiet demand for accountability. It was the fact that someone had finally seen her for what she was, a person worthy of respect, dignity, and fairness. "I appreciate you being here," she said finally, her voice steady but thick with emotion. Her eyes met his, a silent acknowledgement of the battle they had just fought together, a battle that was far from over. It wasn't about this moment, this airport ordeal, it was about everything that led to it, everything that would follow. She knew the work they had ahead of them wasn't easy. Fighting for justice, fighting for equality, it was exhausting work. But that didn't matter. She had a renewed sense of determination now, a fire that had been reignited in the face of this adversity. This was part of the fight. And the fact that she had someone like Richard by her side gave her more strength than she had realized she had left. The airline staff, having been dismissed by Richard's unyielding authority, now seemed to scatter, leaving Emily and Richard alone in the sterile room. Emily turned her gaze out the window, watching the planes taking off in the distance. A part of her longed to be on one of those planes, to be with her family, to bury the weight of this experience somewhere far behind her. But another part of her, stronger now than it had been in hours, knew that this moment would fuel something larger. Something that wouldn't fade with the passing of time. She would use this. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had faced the same sort of humiliation, the same systemic prejudice. "I'm going to write about this," she said, almost to herself. "Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong." She could feel the words already taking form, already shaping the foundation of her next public statement. Her mind, once fogged by anger and confusion, was clearing now, focusing on the fight ahead. Richard, sensing the shift in her, placed a hand on her shoulder. "You'll make a difference," he said with quiet certainty. "I hope so," Emily replied, her voice a mix of determination and weariness. "I hope so." As they walked out of the room together, the tension of the moment finally beginning to ease, Emily felt like she was walking into something bigger. This wasn't the end of the story. In fact, it was just the beginning. The fight she was about to embark on would stretch far beyond this airport, beyond the walls of this building, and it would reach every corner of the country where people, just like her, were treated as if they didn't matter. She had been seen. She had been heard. And she would make sure everyone else would be, too. As Emily and Richard made their way out of the terminal, the cool breeze of the late afternoon air hit them, carrying with it the distant hum of the airport's activity. It felt like the world was moving at a pace they weren't quite part of anymore. They had just stepped away from a tense confrontation, but the weight of it all still hung heavily in the air, even as they walked side by side, both lost in their own thoughts. Emily glanced around, the noise of the airport now feeling distant and surreal, like a backdrop to the real drama that had unfolded here today. It had started as an ordeal, an unfair, unjust treatment that had rattled her sense of security and fairness. But now, something different had taken root in her heart. It wasn't anger anymore, it was a quiet fire, a steady resolve that had replaced her initial sense of humiliation. She glanced over at Richard, who was walking with that quiet, unshakable calmness she had come to depend on. It was clear that he wasn't just a bystander in this. He wasn't just there to support her, he was part of this fight. The weight of his years of experience, his understanding of the system, had made all the difference. For a moment, she allowed herself to lean on that strength, feeling a brief flicker of relief. But deep down, she knew she couldn't rely on him forever. He had given her the tools to stand up for herself, to use her voice in ways that mattered, and that was the key. The real change wouldn't come from what he could do, it would come from what she could do. She could still feel the residue of the experience in her chest, that ache that came from being treated like an outsider, despite her position and her rights. The sting of being dismissed, ignored, and humiliated was not something she could easily forget. But there was a new sense of power in that sting now. A power she hadn't realized she was capable of tapping into. She had survived it, and she had done more than just survive, she had fought back. She had stood up for herself, for her dignity, and now she knew that she could keep doing that, not just for herself, but for the countless others who were out there facing the same challenges. As they walked toward the parking lot, Emily could feel a shift within her. She was more than just a congresswoman. She was a voice for the countless individuals who had been ignored, marginalized, and mistreated. She had a platform, a pulpit from which she could speak out about the very issues that had plagued her today: racial profiling, implicit bias, and the everyday injustices that so many people endured. Her role had just become clearer than ever before. She wasn't just here to pass laws, she was here to fight for the dignity of every person, regardless of their background or status. "I think I'm ready to speak out about this," she said, breaking the silence between them. Her voice was steady now, the earlier uncertainty gone, replaced by a quiet but unmistakable conviction. "It's not just about what happened to me. It's about every single person who has ever been made to feel small because of the color of their skin or the way they look." Richard gave a slight nod, a reassuring smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You'll do it in your own way, Emily. And it'll make a difference." Emily didn't respond right away. She wasn't sure exactly how she would frame it, how she would convey everything she was feeling, but she knew one thing: this wasn't just another moment to be forgotten. This was the beginning of something that needed to be heard, something that could start a shift, not just in the airport, but in the world at large. As they approached the car, Emily felt a sense of clarity wash over her. It wasn't just about fighting the system, it was about speaking the truth, sharing her experience, and shedding light on the darkness that too many people lived in day after day. This was bigger than her, bigger than the incident with the airline. It was about making sure that the world saw people for who they truly were, worthy of respect, of dignity, of fairness. When they got into the car, Emily settled into the seat, her hands resting in her lap, the familiar weight of her phone in her pocket. Her thoughts turned briefly to her cousin, whose funeral she had missed, and the sorrow that accompanied that. But she quickly pushed it aside. There would be time for grief later. Now, she had work to do. There was a bigger conversation to start, one that she couldn't afford to wait on any longer. And this was just the beginning. As the car pulled out of the parking lot, Emily gazed out the window at the sprawling city around her. The world was waiting, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face it head-on. When Richard Sanders, retired federal judge, decorated veteran, and husband of 32 years, walked into that terminal, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. With quiet authority, he demanded answers. Not apologies. Not upgrades. Not freebies. Just one thing, accountability. And when the airline finally offered first-class tickets and corporate apologies, it was Emily who responded with the words that shook the room. You didn't apologize when I was alone. You only acted when someone important showed up. And that's the problem. The video of what happened went viral. But it wasn't the confrontation that resonated, it was the truth behind it. Because Emily knew something that too many people experience every day. Not everyone has a powerful name to text when things go wrong. And that's why, in her next town hall, she promised not to begin with policy, or party lines, or polling numbers. She would begin with stories, stories like hers. Stories like yours. Because respect isn't a luxury reserved for the powerful. It's a right. And it's time we treated it that way.